Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I want to welcome you to the Art Talk Multiple Realities, Navigating Experimental Art in Central Eastern Europe, 1960s to 1980s. I'm very excited about the talk this evening in conjunction with our newest exhibition. My name is Tiffany Lippincott, Curator of Education at the Phoenix Art Museum, and I'd like to personally welcome you all for taking the time to come here, supporting the museum, and to deepen your understanding and engagement with art in our galleries. So before we begin, I would like to remind you to please silence your phones or turn them off. That would be great. And then to begin tonight's program, I'd also like to welcome to the podium Rachel Zebro, Associate Curator of Collections. Hi everyone. How's everyone doing tonight? Good. Thank you so much for being here as we celebrate the public opening of Multiple Realities, Experimental Art in the Eastern Bloc, 1960s to 1980s, which I hope you have all had the opportunity to see. As Tiffany mentioned, my name is Rachel Zebro. I'm the Associate Curator of Collections here at Phoenix Art Museum, and I also had the pleasure of coordinating the presentation of this exhibition here in Phoenix. Before we begin, I would like to thank the O Patroni Family Foundation for their support of this exhibition. Don and Judy, which are here with us today. So thank you both so much. This is a very important exhibition for us all to have here in the Valley. I am excited to introduce to you tonight the curator of Multiple Realities, Pavel Pyś, who's going to provide insight into what is the largest survey of Central Eastern European art to date. Multiple Realities is an exhibition that focuses on the period between 1960s and 1980s from 6 different countries: Yugoslavia, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. It emphasizes the point that art made during this time was complex, as artists were aware of the possibility of surveillance and censorship, and they sought to be political in the most unpolitical ways, by using humor, wit, satire, and absurdity. In other words, this exhibition is not what you think it is. Pavel has done a remarkable job in curating an exhibition that reminds us of art's powerful capacity, even in its most subtle forms, to challenge dominant powers. A strong and relevant message that resonates with us today. Pavel joined the Walker Art Center in 2016, where he is the Curator of Visual Arts and Collection Strategy. At the Walker, he has curated solo exhibitions by Daniel Buren, Paul Chan, currently on view at Contemporary Art Museum St. Louis, Faye Driscoll, Michaela Eichwald, Carolyn Lazard, Sarah Mickelson, and Elizabeth Price, as well as the group exhibition The Body Electric. In 2018, he was awarded an Andy Warhol Foundation Curatorial Fellowship, which aided research toward multiple realities, which after Phoenix Art will travel to the Vancouver Art Gallery. Walker projects include exhibitions with Ralph Lemon and Kevin Beasley, Pam DeJong, and Christine Sunkim. In 2022, Pavel co-curated Kingdom of the Third at Museum Bolzano with Sarah Klugish. Between 2011 and 2015, he was the Exhibitions and Displays Curator at the Henry Moore Institute in Leeds. He has published essays on artists including Trisha Baga, Carol Bove, Alina Shaposhnikov, and others. Please join me in welcoming Pavel Pyś.
Good evening. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see you all here. I want to start by thanking the incredible museum team here, Jeremy, Olga, but especially I want to thank Rachel because she did an incredible job putting this show together and making it look so beautiful in the galleries, and really approached the show with great passion, interest, curiosity, so thank you, Rachel. So I'm going to talk about the exhibition. I'm going to set a timer so that I don't bore you too much beyond the 45 minutes that I'm allowed. But really I just wanted to share with you a little bit of the behind the scenes and kind of some of the larger questions that really informed the approach to this exhibition. It's a really big exhibition, and there's a lot to get into. So I just want to share with you a little bit about how I approach that. The first thing I will say is that this has been the most collaborative endeavor I've ever done. I worked with 6 curatorial consultants that we hired on this show, and if you look at the acknowledgments section in the catalog and the number of names there, we really worked with dozens of artists, scholars, art historians, and people who are both in and out of the region to surface amazing works, and many of the artists that you see in the galleries have never been on view in the United States before. I want to start maybe actually at the end. This is an image that is from 1987, so towards the end of the temporal scope of this exhibition, which starts in the 60s and runs right up to the end of the fall of the wall. I love this image. It's a very simple one. It's a photograph of an artist called Lubomir Durček. It was taken in what is now Slovakia, in Bratislava. And it's, I think, a great thing to start with because I think you can read this image in a couple of ways. Here we see the artist standing on a street corner, and what you see above him is actually, this is the meeting point of 2 squares. So if we were to zoom in, and you can probably see it there on the left, it says Soviet, and on the right it says American. And he's standing at the meeting point of the 2. And I love this image. I think it's a great one to start with because you can read it, I think, in 2 ways. Here we have an individual at the interstice of 2 major powers, and so we might read this person as simply being at a time and in a place where they don't really have much control over the political, social, economic circumstances that they're living through. But I think there's also another way to read this image, which is that he's holding his hands in his pockets, which actually in Europe is not a gesture that's really, it's a little frowned upon. And so I think there's actually a really beautiful nonchalance in this image too. And I think that he's actually having fun with us a little bit. I think you can read this image also of him kind of actually being a little bit indifferent and nonchalant to the circumstances that surround him. And I'd like to start with this because I think many of the works that you see in the galleries, you can read in 2, 3, 4 ways. There are many, many layers of meaning in a lot of these works. And so I really encourage you as you walk through the show to maybe think about this image and have it in your mind when you start looking at the work. When you make a show like this, you are covering a lot of ground. And also this show has a very generous temporal scope. And so questions that you have to contend with as a curator are big. Where do you start? Where do you end? Do you make an exhibition that's thematic, or should you arrange it chronologically? Should you think about it as based on nationality? What are the stories that you want to tell? Whose voices do you want to elevate? And I think every group exhibition is as much an exercise in inclusion as it is in exclusion. Because of course, budget, space, time, those are all finite things. So the choices that you're making as a curator, you're always contending with that. When we think about Central Eastern Europe, I think that our cultural, and let's say our shared social imaginaries, they're often shaped by texts, by cultural texts that dominate, or you could say simply shout the loudest. And so I'm opening here with Bridge of Spies, as a maybe example of that. A major Hollywood movie, massive visibility, and certainly a movie that trades in some cliches, right? It's a movie that shows and portrays a part of Central Eastern Europe as cold, dangerous, gray, boring. Did I say cold? Cold, gray. Lots of concrete, lots of hammer and sickles, lots of homogeneity. And so if that's an enduring cliche that people might have in mind, how do you open that up? How do you disrupt it? You might know this other great movie that came out called Goodbye Lenin, which was a wonderful film in which an individual who lived through the reality of Eastern Germany falls into a coma and wakes up in the newly reunified Germany, but her family does everything to make sure that she doesn't realize what's actually happened, and they go around making this elaborate kind of fake East Germany for her to keep living in. This is a wonderful still from that movie, where she realizes that something is a little bit off as this statue of Lenin is flying through the city streets. But I bring these 2 stills together just to kind of say that exhibitions, I think, have the power to open up these assumptions, and that cliches and assumptions and ways that we see the world can be subverted, they can be opened up. And I really hope that Multiple Realities is an occasion to really think about how this time, and especially the art that was made in this time and place, was nuanced and adventurous and paradoxical and absurd and ironic at times. So here is a slide that shows you roughly what we're contending with, which is 6 nations that Rachel mentioned. Their borders here are in bold. This exhibition crisscrosses time and place. It starts in the 1960s, it runs all the way to the 1980s. It covers essentially half of Europe in its geographic footprint. And it really very carefully looks at how art was made, how it was circulated, how it was received. And it really tries to give viewers a greater sense of how art could exist and how it could not exist. There are many assumptions about what this time and place was like, and so essentially each slide that I want to share with you tonight is kind of a cliche and then its disruption. So that's how I'm going to structure the talk. I'm going to unpick these cliches and show you different ways to look at this time and place. I'm going to start with an artist that you're probably familiar with, and that's Jenny Holzer. This is a work called Vote Your Future from 2020. And I'm starting with this work because I think one of the biggest things that people associate with this time, with Central Eastern Europe, is the idea that you either had to be on the inside or you had to be on the outside. You had to either be completely aligned with the way that the state wanted you to make art, or you had to be a dissident and be oppositional. And I want to kind of take a moment to question that. I think that there's a great quote that I want to bring up, which is that the painter and sculptor Georg Baselitz said, there was abstraction in the West and realism in the East. And he essentially was saying that what was in the West was better, what was in the East was simply realism. It was bad painting, it was socialist realism that the state wanted you as artists to produce, to kind of repeat the stereotype of the hard-working socialist hero. And I want to start by thinking about this kind of binary between abstraction and figuration, between abstraction and realism, because it's a really interesting one. Abstraction is something that I think we tend to associate with this moment, in the mid-century moment, of the capital of the art world moving from Paris to New York, of the kind of rise of American artists. And abstraction becomes this amazing story of free-spiritedness, of a new frontier in art, of doing whatever you want and at a large and ambitious scale. And it's interesting because if you think about the history of abstraction in the US, many of those artists who came from European backgrounds actually had socialist, some had communist leanings. But the promotion of abstraction and the way that's been written into history here, it's a history of that kind of free-spiritedness. And so it becomes tied to ideas of Western individualism, it becomes tied to capitalism, as opposed to socialist realism, which is just supposed to be this kind of visual language that the East and that the States were promoting. But I bring this up because it does actually, I think, lead us to a quite stiff understanding of what can be political in art. And this is where I come back to Jenny Holzer. Because I think many people here associate the political in art with meaning that is really legible. Vote for affordable medication. What you see is right on the surface. The political meaning is right there. It's shouting at you. It's very clear. It's in bold. It's in capital letters. And I think that we have this kind of expectation here that to understand the political meaning of an artwork, we want the artwork to tell us what that meaning is. And in this show, there's a lot of political meaning, but often it's deep, 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 deep under layers. Layers of abstraction, layers of new materials, but also irony, parody, winking. So if you go into this show and you have this expectation that artists who were not making work within state restrictions or aligned with the state, if you have this expectation that their work was dissident and nonconformist, you'll be very hard-pressed to find those voices. Opposition and dissidence is in the show, but what I love about the work is that you have to really scratch, and you have to dig in, and you have to find it. I'll start first with probably the most political, and then I'll slowly unpeel the layers so that we can look at how to locate the political beyond just the surface. The first work that you see when you come into the show is a pretty confronting work. I'm very proud that it's in the exhibition. It's melting much faster in the desert than it did in Minnesota. This image shows it installed in the Walker's galleries. I was sharing with Rachel and with Olga when we were walking through the show, that this is one of those works that's just, it's such a joy as a curator to research, because you find things and then you can bring them into the present. And when I found this work, it was just a black and white grainy image in a Hungarian catalog, but through conversations with Hungarian peers and with artists, I understood the incredible potence of this piece. And so this is the first time that this particular work has ever been on view outside of Europe. It's the first time it's on view in the United States. It's called Bleeding Monument. And it's quite simple. It consists of, although the installation crew would say it's not that simple, but it consists of a large block of ice that has been smothered in potassium permanganate, which is a substance that you use to treat wounds. And then it's been covered in gauze. And so what's happening, and you can already see that now, is that as the sculpture liquefies, as the ice turns into liquid, the potassium interacts with the liquid and turns it red. And so as you stand in front of the work, you have this incredible piece which approximates a wounded body in front of you. And it will change over the next 2-3 weeks when you come back and see the show. This work was made in 1969, and I was reflecting on that. 1969 in Hungary was a time of kind of liberalization, but actually it's just 1 year after the Prague Spring, which was not so far away, this moment of the quashing, a very violent quashing of pro-democratic movement in Czechoslovakia. It's only 13 years after 1956, which was the year of the Hungarian Revolution, when exactly the same circumstances happened in Budapest, in Hungary, a time when ordinary citizens like you and I would have had to rush home and find potassium permanganate and treat your fellow citizen on the street who's wounded in an attack. And actually 1969 in Hungary, that's only 24 years from the end of the Second World War, which 24 years might sound like an abstract long time, but actually 9/11 was pretty much that long ago. So for you, in your kind of experience of the world, I think that puts it in a perspective which can just show how current a work like this is. And of course, you can also read this piece in different ways, given what's happening around the world today. This particular work was censored 2 days after it was shown. And so I think in this show, I'm very proud that it's in the show, but I start with it because I think it is probably the most overt in its political meaning. Next to it is a work that I had hoped to include, but it's quite fragile, it can't travel. But it speaks very much to similar concerns. It's by an artist that I'll talk about a little bit later too, another Hungarian artist called Tamás Szentjogi. It's called Portable Trench for Three, and the title really explains the work, which is, it again references this moment in these events like the Hungarian Revolution, when people like you and I would just make portable trenches to help people on the street. So I start with these because I think they are certainly the most legible in their political meaning. But I want to go now to a work also by a Hungarian artist, which has a lot of political meaning, but I think it does it in the most unpolitical way, and I love it deeply because there's a little bit of doublespeak going on here. So in this clip, it doesn't have sound, I'm going to talk over it. What we're seeing here is 1974, so this is a moment of kind of things getting a little bit tougher in Hungary after the kind of liberal period of the late 60s, early 70s. This is a fantastic, I love also the hippie like hairband and everything. This is a great film that was made for national television, in which this particular artist, István Haraszti, is talking about a new work that he made. This new work consists of a bird cage, and you can see there's a bird moving inside the bird cage. And what happens here is that when the bird is on the far end of the cage, the doors are open to the cage. But the moment the bird comes close to the cage and its doors, they snap shut. The bird can never escape the cage. And this clip is so great because if we were to listen to István Haraszti talking about this work, he would be talking about it in terms of the relationship between our species and animals. He's talking about the relationship to new technology, advancements in new technology, the motorization of everyday life. He does not in any way mention or touch upon or even slightly allude to the other meaning in this work, which is entrapment and being in a system that you can't escape. There, the bird comes and they can't leave. And so I think this is such a great example of this kind of, as I refer to it, politics with a lowercase p, which is that political meaning is there, and it's really, it's vital to the work. But just because it's not on the surface doesn't mean that it's not there. It doesn't mean that we can't grasp it. And it takes, we have to kind of unpick it and go beyond just the surface. I love this example. I mentioned this earlier, that many viewers might have this assumption that you had to be either on the inside or on the outside. That's a quite simple binary. It's a good one to apply to the Soviet Union, where restrictions were really clear and the line was very clear. And if you look at Soviet art history, there is a very clear distinction between those who were working aligned with the party expectations and those who were not. And there's an entire movement of artists called the Soviet non-conformist artists. Things like samizdat or dissidents, those are terms that make a lot of sense when we think about the Soviet Union. But when we think about Central Eastern Europe, those terms do not have the same meaning or relevance. What's so beautiful about this period and this region is that things are really ambiguous. They're very gray. And so this is a really good example. I want to talk about how artists had to negotiate often really conflicting and very paradoxical situations. This is an example of a Slovak artist. He's called Julius Koller. Those of you who have been in the show, you will have seen a little cluster of materials that relate to his ping pong projects. He was an artist who, to survive and to have a paycheck, he made quite drab landscapes. And you can see him holding one up here on the left-hand side. He doesn't look particularly thrilled. It's a boring landscape, but it's an important one because it's actually showing Bratislava and this amazing UFO bridge that was built at the time. He made these, and they were sold through a state-run chain of souvenir stores. So it's a kind of place where you might go to buy arts and crafts. He would sell these paintings through the store, he would have a paycheck. But actually, if you look at Koller's work, and if you think about his importance to art history, it's really, he's a figure who did crazy conceptual proposals. One, for example, is turning a gallery into a place where you could simply hang out and play ping pong. Another project that he realized that is in the galleries too is he proposed establishing a gallery on a mountain pass that was completely impossible to get to. And then he organized the first committee of curators to decide the program. He did swag, he did merch, and so that is the core thrust of his work. Whereas this is how he was able to survive. And so these conflicting and really weird positions where you had to have one foot in one world and another foot elsewhere is very typical of many of the artists in this show. If you read about the exhibition, you will probably come across this figure. And I really like talking about these works because they're a little bit, I don't like to use the word discovery, but they are a little bit of that, which is that they really are not so well known even in Germany and certainly not outside of Europe. Jürgen Wittdorf was an artist who had a quite eccentric life. He taught drawing to border guards. He was occasionally hired by the Communist Party. And this particular work is an example of that. He was hired by a sports academy in Leipzig to create a series of woodcuts that would celebrate youth and sport. We have 4 examples of those woodcuts in the galleries. They're really striking, interesting works. If you look at them, there's something else going on in these images. And it's interesting because these were made in 1964. Homosexuality remained a taboo subject in East Germany. Homosexuality was decriminalized about 4 years after he made this in 1968, so there was also an element of risk to him making these. But the question is, how could this happen? These were officially commissioned. It gets even better. They were on permanent view in this sports academy for 30 years. They were also mass reproduced in a youth Communist Party journal. They had very wide visibility. And so the question is always, how is this possible? Well, maybe the censor thought, well, we have here the hero of socialist realism. We have here, in other images it's the bricklayer. Here we have workers in the shower. maybe the censor was hungover that day, maybe they were sympathetic to him. So I think this is also one of those great examples that to think about an artist's political and ideological affiliation in very black and white terms won't really get you very far. There's a lot of nuance and a lot of kind of grayness to this. The fourth section also has some very interesting stories in this show. That's a section called Looking to the Future. I remarked on this earlier that you could curate that room across any geography at the time. Everyone in the 1960s and 70s was obsessed with the space race and satellites and new forms of technology. New technology was not delayed in the Eastern Bloc. Major institutions, governmental bodies all had access to new technology, but it was delayed at a domestic level. In that gallery, we have several artists who were also mathematicians, who were also engineers. Many of them were also hired in capacities where they were working for scientific research institutes, for example. And they had, let's say, a real job. Being an artist is a real job, but they had a real job as an engineer, but they were using their access to technology at the same time to tinker with it, explore it, see what kind of aesthetic capacities are inherent in these new technologies. I also included here a slide on the right, some images of an incredible figure in this show, a Czech artist called Zdenka Čechová, who was really one of the first artists in Czechoslovakia in the late 60s to start using computers in art. And she was wildly adventurous. And here, you can see a number of projects that she made using computer algorithms. Some of these works are printed and appear in the galleries, but she was very adventurous. She also did fashion shows with computer algorithm fashion. She also made a line of glassware that she wanted to sell through department stores with imagery that was resultant of computer algorithms. So again, you can see someone who's making work that wasn't really expected, but or also finding official ways of distributing it at the same time. Being an artist at this time was and could be risky. It just depended on where you were, at which moment, in which country, in what context. This is a group of photographs that are in the galleries. We were so lucky to host this artist here in Phoenix this week, the amazing, trailblazing, East German experimental filmmaker, feminist artist, Gabriele Stutzer. This is a great example of risk in everyday life. This is a series of photographs that she took. She was very much tied into the underground scene. People knew her. She was tied with the underground queer scene in East Berlin. And she was approached by this man who said, I would like you to capture me trying on different women's clothing. Would you be interested in taking photos of me? And she said, sure, great. And so you see those images in the gallery. It wasn't until the wall fell and this artist, like many others in East Germany, got access to the secret police files. It was then that she found out that this particular individual was actually a secret police informant, tasked with watching her and gathering information about her. And I think it's a modest work. It's a grid of 16 photographs, but it's a fantastic piece because it raises so many questions. Who's watching who? Is Gabriela really watching this particular individual who was known as Winfried, or is actually Winfried watching Gabriela? It's a really great example of this risk. Another example of how risky it could be to be an artist are these images. This is a really incredible story. These come from a moment in the 1970s, in 1973, when in a beautiful part of Hungary, in a remote part of Hungary, near the Balaton Lake, Hungarian art critic György Galantai, he arranged for these meetings for Czech, Slovak, and Hungarian artists to simply hang out and get to know each other. This happened every summer. They had access to a chapel, and they would just hang out. They would listen to music, they would make art, they would smoke, they would drink, they would eat together. And in these images, these are images that show a performance that took place by someone called Laszlo Algol. It had a quite convoluted title. I'm not going to read it out, but you can see it there. These images actually show a spy. This particular person, Laszlo, was a secret police operative who was planted within this community. And he was tasked with watching other artists and then informing on them. But what's really wild about these images is that in this piece, he, as an informant, was making a performance in which he was testing ideas about having triple identities. And then he encircles everyone with a net. So he's a spy, tasked with watching these people, and he does that by making a performance about having multiple identities. That just shows you how paradoxical and crazy this kind of operating as an artist at this time could be. In the show, there are various spaces that we refer to as content rooms, and I really hope you get a chance to spend a little bit of time in them. They provide interpretive anchoring around the social, historical, political picture. One thing that I'm really excited about in these rooms is that they really kind of pummel some stereotypes. One is this stereotype that the Iron Curtain was impassable. It's not true, it just depends again on time and place. And there are great stories in those rooms. There are stories about artists from the Global South coming to Czechoslovakia, to Poland, learning how to make films. There are incredible stories about artists who are doing mail art, sending each other bits through the mail, creating incredible works where there's one very famous East German mail artist who made a great work which was simply the slogan, "Don't think of me now." And so you can imagine the censor opening the mail and realizing the work, reading the piece of paper. This is a lovely performance from 1982, which was a really tough time in Romania for these three artists, and I find it so poignant and so beautiful. It's a performance in which they created this giant envelope, and then they all crawled into it, holding hands, hoping that it would transport them elsewhere. Many scholars, and I think the great opportunity of a show like this is to really open up one of the kind of more arrogant things about art history, which is this kind of idea that if you weren't in the center, then you were belated, or you were derivative of those more famous artists who happened to be at the right place at the right time. There are many works in this show that haven't been on view in 40, 50 years. There are many works in this show that have never been on view since they were made. And there are many works in this show who were made by artists who had zero visibility in terms of understanding what was being made in Western Europe or in North America. And I like to stop and kind of talk about these two because I think they really nicely kind of give us a sense of caution. So on the left-hand side is a very famous work, a work that's been widely collected, written about extensively. It's a piece called Condensation Cube by Hans Haacke. This is a very famous work in terms of the history of minimalism by a New York artist who, in this moment in the 1960s, he was thinking about how systems work, whether it was weather systems or biological systems. And he did something very beautiful, which is he took a hard and rigid minimalist form, a cube, and then he introduced a meteorological event into it. And so condensation cubes basically have sterilized liquid in them. They heat up, and then they liquefy, and they do this over and over again. It's a really beautiful work about, can an artist control weather? Where does an artist's agency begin and end? On the other side here is a work by an unknown, let's say, in the West Hungarian artist Tamás Szentjogi, the artist who made the portable trench for 3 that I mentioned earlier. This is a work that was made at the same time, 1965. The two artists did not know one another. When Szentjogi was showing this work, he essentially would have a glass vessel, which he would fill with warm water, and then he would let it cool. Once it cooled, he would repeat it again. It's a work that, in very simple terms, illustrates cultural freezes and thaws, this kind of cycle of liberalization and then restriction. When he spoke about it in 2012, he said, he actually talked about it in the terms that Haacke would have talked about his work. He said that this work, very facetiously, he claims, it shows the wonderful, miraculous, invisible, gentle process of cooling and heading towards entropy. And I think it's so interesting that even in 2012, so many years after he made this piece, he refuses to give you the political meaning. He refuses to spell it out. But I think here it's a really interesting comparison because to frame these within a shared language is really hard. If we talk about these in relation to minimalism, Haacke will probably win. But if we talk about it in relation to politics, then suddenly Sentjeri's work takes on a totally kind of, let's say, different meaning, a prime place in terms of how we think about these two works. There are many, many examples of this in the show, and I think the great promise of experiencing art that you're unfamiliar with is that you can open up your assumptions, you can reread them in different ways. So these are just some teasers of kind of the larger questions that we faced in terms of putting this show together, which is how do you reframe politics, and how do you reframe and locate the political in an artwork when you can't really immediately see it? How do artists have to contend with choices that they have to make in their lives, given the conditions that they were living in? How do artists find a place in relation to institutions? How do artists build community? How do they build solidarity and friendship? These are all very important and incredibly timely questions that I think many artists are still thinking about today. And so the question is, when you do a historical show like this, when you go into the past, you have to ask yourselves, why are you doing it now? Why should you care about vintage material like this? And I think those framing questions are really good ones, but I think that there are so many other ways to think about this show and look at the material and think about its relationship to today. Of course, this show started years ago. It started 5 years ago. And so certainly in terms of the region, the reality of Russian aggression in Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine, casts a new light on this show in terms of the meaning of this work in the region. Something that, of course, was not foreseen when we started working on this 5-6 years ago. But it again it urges us to think again about cultural imperialism. It urges us to think about violence and the role that quashing a nation's culture is a form of control and of violence. Within the region itself, this is in the last 8 to 10 years, we've seen persistent erosion of democratic processes. We've seen really scary nationalist discourses happen in this region. And then finally, more recently, we've seen a turning point. And so also the spirit of disobedience, of questioning these modes of control seems really, really present again. A big question here that this show deals with is also surveillance, especially the first gallery. What you see here on the left-hand side is an amazing object that I held and saw in my hand when I did a studio visit with Josif Kirali in Bucharest. He was one of the 3 that climbed into that giant envelope in that performance. This is a really amazing object. Basically what you're looking at is a kind of whittled piece of plastic which has a little ending there at the top, and it has a hole, and then it's attached to what was maybe part of a wooden spoon or a spatula, and there's also a hole at the bottom of this. And so when communism ended in Romania, one of Kirali's students, he was seeing that the state archives were opened up and you could actually go and see things, and he pocketed this object. This object was actually connected to a hose that had steam in it. So the steam would rush through the wooden handle, and then it would shoot through the top of the plastic ending there. And people in the postal office, in the postal service, would use this tool to open envelopes to make sure that they could read your correspondence. And I think it's so amazing because we are consistently under surveillance. It's just more invisible, it's in our phones now. But to hold this object and to see it and to understand the very analog kind of physicality of it is really powerful, which is also what this work in the galleries is talking about. This is a work from Romania from the 1970s, which has a very innocent kitchen still life, but then as you zoom in and you realize that the telephone has been disconnected and the cord has been wrapped around, you understand, of course, that the phone and phone tapping was the primary way of surveying the population at the time. These are not new concerns, these are concerns that we're facing and that we're subject to, and increasingly these forms of controlling our lives are invisible. And so I think it's very powerful to see these works that remind us of the materiality, the physicality, of the fact that these things exist in our lives. I mentioned a little bit that the show has a resonance in the region, especially in relation to the erosion of democratic processes. I would probably not limit that just to the region. I would say that we've seen that in many different places, far away but also nearby. We've seen moments where individual values, civil liberties have been reversed and stalled. A topic that seems incredibly important and pertinent given where we are literally right now in this room. And I think the great power of many of the artists that we have in this show is that they really demonstrate the role of disobedience. They really speak to the power of simply saying no and placing your body in a public space and refusing and using your body to protest and to oppose and to have a voice. And I think there's an enduring, perennial relevance of so many of these strategies that we see that were used at that time that so many are using today. I don't want to end on that note. It's a little bit of a downer. So I'll end on a more positive note, which is that for me, I think also a lot of what we see in this show speaks to community. So many of these artists were seeking community. They were looking for friends. They were looking for people to hang out with. Here we have, on the left-hand side, during COVID, a really amazing artist galvanized project, which was spearheaded by many disabled artists, crip artists who were fundraising to help other friends who needed access to healthcare. On the right-hand side is the amazing project Summer Everything in LA by Lauren Halsey. These are ways of creating community, of supporting your community, and finding your voice, finding ways to be together. And so for me, I think this exhibition, what I love so much about these artists, is that I think that they are showing us how to be audacious, how to be tenacious, how to persist in making work, and how to keep experimenting in the face of hardship. And for me, I think that's incredibly moving, that even in the darkest of times, artists will keep going. They ensure that art and disobedience flourish. Thank you.